First, I'm going to talk about an overview of the Trump-era tariff policy and how it affected Oceania. I'll go through the nature of this tariff, the timeline of the TR implementation, and the rationale behind the policy decisions made in 2025. In early 2025, the US introduced a new wave of tariffs under President Trump. These tariffs affected steel and aluminum imports and ended previous exemptions for at least like Australia. A 10% baseline tariff was also placed on all imports, and some countries in Oceania, like Fiji and Nauru, were hit with even higher rates. This sudden change disrupted long-standing trade relations and caused significant uncertainty in the region. Next is the tariff rates, targeted sectors, and timeline. The tariffs were introduced in phases. First, steel and aluminium were targeted, hitting Australia's metal industry hard. Then, a blanket 10% tariff was applied to a wide range of goods including agriculture and manufacturing exports. Countries with larger trade surpluses, like Fiji and Nauru, faced higher tariffs over 30%. The timeline was very tight, with little time for affected countries to respond or negotiate, which increased tensions. Now I'm going to talk about the rationale behind US tariff policy. So the US government claimed the tariffs were necessary to fix trade imbalances and protect national security. Although Australia and New Zealand are long-term allies, they were not spared. Past trade disputes, like Australia's ban on US beef, were used to justify their inclusion. Pacific Island nations were also affected, despite their small trade volumes, raising concerns about fairness and diplomacy.
Now, we will move on to the second section, which focuses on the regional economic impact of the 2025 tariff. For this part, we focus mainly on Australia as it represents the largest economy in Oceania and was directly affected by US tariff policies. Alright, so what happened with the 2025 tariff? In 2025, the United States, under Trump's administration, reintroduced aggressive tariffs targeting agriculture, electronics, and industrial inputs. These tariffs were positioned as a strategy to protect domestic industries and reduce trade deficits. However, for Australia, the response was mixed. Although partial exemptions were granted, businesses remained cautious due to policy uncertainty. This caution reflected broader concern about long-term trade reliability with the US. As a result of these renewed tariffs, many exporters began redirecting their trade routes toward ASEAN, China, and Japan, regions perceived as more stable and predictable. Imports from the US became not only more expensive but also less dependable, disrupting previous supply agreements. Consequently, firms in Australia and the Oceania region strategically restructured their supply chains to minimize risk and sustain trade continuity. These shifts highlight the region's strong adaptability in facing global trade shocks. So now let's take a look at the trade balance for early 2025. As shown in Table 1, Australia was the largest US trade partner in Oceania. From January to March, the US recorded a total trade deficit of $3.7 billion. But by April, we can see a strong recovery with a $1.1 billion surplus, which indicates that Australia managed to quickly adjust to the new tariffs. This early trend helps us understand the direct impact of the 2025 tariff changes on trade balance. However, for trade volume and supply chain data, the available 2025 information is still quite limited. So in the next slide, we will refer to 2018 to 2020 data as a baseline for comparison and deeper analysis. Next, we look at overall trade volume. Despite rising global tensions, the total volume of trade between Australia and the US held firm from 2018 to 2020. This suggests that strong bilateral ties and targeted exemptions help maintain consistent flows. Figure 2 is also crucial as it sets a reference point, so any major drops or shift in 2025 would signal a real impact. Now let's focus on how firms responded to the new 2025 tariffs. This table shows clear evidence of supply chain diversification in Oceania. Companies started shifting away from US sources, choosing alternatives like South Korea, Japan, Germany, and Vietnam. Why? Mainly to avoid tariff risk, reduce logistics costs, and secure more predictable pricing. Interestingly, this mirrors 2018 patterns, showing how Oceania has maintained strong trade adaptability.
So now, let's move to the retaliation and diplomatic response. Today, I will be discussing the retaliation and diplomatic responses of Oceania to the Trump-era tariff, specifically the Section 232 tariff on steel and aluminium, and how these measures have continued to impact the region out to 2025. First, in terms of overall impact, these tariffs have significantly affected Australia and New Zealand, while the Pacific Island nations have mainly experienced indirect consequences due to broader disruption in global trade and supply chains. Let's focus on Australia first. Australia is the country that was able to secure an exemption from this tariff back in 2018. However, this exemption came with strict volume quotas, which are still in place today and continue to limit Australian exporters' ability to expand their presence in the US market. In response, Australia has maintained a diplomatic relationship with the United States, consistently working to renegotiate this condition and advocating for quota reform. At the same time, Australia has prioritized trade diversification by participating in regional initiatives like the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP, and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. This strategy aims to reduce dependence on a single market and strengthen regional economic integration. Moving on to New Zealand, unlike Australia, they did not receive any exemption from the tariff. Instead of retaliating with counter-tariff, New Zealand has pursued a consistent rules-based diplomatic approach. Since 2018, it has filed formal objection through the World Trade Organization, arguing that the US justification for this tariff under the premise of national security is not accurate. This approach reflects New Zealand's commitment to cooperation, fairness, and adherence to international law, and it continues to be engaged in WTO consultation to promote effective dispute resolution. In the case of the Pacific Island nations, such as Fiji, Papua New Guinea, and Samoa, they were not directly targeted by the tariff, mainly because they have limited trade in industrial goods with the United States. However, these countries have been indirectly affected by the uncertainty and instability in global trade, which have disrupted key sectors like agriculture, fisheries, and tourism. Despite these challenges, the Pacific Island nations have remained focused on regional integration and development assistance and have avoided engaging in confrontational and retaliatory actions. Overall, Oceania's response can be described as diplomatic and non-confrontational, while Australia continues to maintain exemption and look for more liberalized trade opportunities. New Zealand has relied on multilateral mechanisms through the WTO, and the Pacific Islands have prioritized regional cooperation. This collective approach demonstrates the region's preference for dialogue, collaboration, and resilience rather than escalation or conflict.
So now we are going to talk about impact on United States. So we will talk about the impact of tariff on the US economy, particularly focusing on the effect on consumer, producer, employment, and inflation. The Trump-era tariff on goods from countries like Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Islands have had significant effect on the US markets. Let's take a closer look on how this change impacted the various sectors. For the number one, impact on the US consumer. The imposition of tariff of goods from countries like Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Islands resulted in a higher price for imported goods, especially in sectors such as agriculture. This led to an increased cost from the products like beef, dairy, and wine. As a result, US consumers had to pay a higher price for this product, forcing them to opt for production alternative or seek the product with fewer tariff impact. Second, impact on the US producer. For US producer, the tariff had a considerable effect on the cost of production. Products reliant on steel and aluminium, such as those used in automobile and construction sectors, saw increased production costs. This led to reduced profit margins for producers, making US goods less competitive globally. Industries depend on foreign materials face to future challenges. Third, impact on the US employment. The tariff also triggered retaliatory measures from the other countries, which is disrupted US export market, particularly in sectors like agriculture. Key industry, including soybean, pork, and corn production, experienced a decline in demand, leading to a reduced employment in agricultural sector. Fourth, impact on the US inflation. In addition to the effect on consumer and producer, the tariff contribute to an overall increase in inflation. Higher production costs for the import goods like beef, dairy, and aluminium lead to increased price for this product, contributing to the rising cost of living. This also diminishes consumer purchasing power as everyday goods become more expensive. In conclusion, the Trump-era tariff on goods from Oceania had to widespread impact on the US economy, from consumer facing higher price to producers struggling with increased production costs and inflation hitting consumer hard. The economic effect were far-reaching. This change highlight the interconnect nature of global trades and the direct impact of local economics.
So, now we will talk about how the effect of the Trump-era tariff on Oceania, especially on Pacific Island nation and Australia. This tariff has caused long-term changes in trade, economic growth, and relationship in this region. First, let's look at the impact on export. Pacific Island nation like Fiji, Vanuatu, and Nauru face high new tariff on their export to the US between 22 and 32%. This made their product less competitive and hurt key industries like bottled water, clothes, and agriculture. Because of this, these countries have started to look for other places to sell their product. Many are turning to China and other Asian countries to trade. This shift is part of a bigger effort to find more stable and reliable trade partners. But the problem is these countries depend heavily on just a few markets. This makes them vulnerable to disruption in supply chain like higher cost or delay in shipping. Next, let's talk about how US tariff have affected trade agreement. Many countries in the Pacific no longer trust the US as a reliable trading partner. The tariff and cuts to it have damaged that trust. Because of this, Pacific Island nations are now looking for other trade deals. They are joining regional agreements like PACER Plus and getting closer to China. This shift is about finding more reliable partner for trade. Also, many countries are asking the US for clarification and solution because the US has not been responsive to their concern. This has pushed them to search for new trade deals and alliances. Now, let's look at the political changes in the region. The US reducing its aid and market access has made China a stronger trading partner. Countries like Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands are getting more involved with China. At the same time, the US pulling back from the region has caused concern about the independence of Pacific nations. This has made them more vulnerable to competition between the US and China. The loss of the US aid combined with economic difficulties has also made these countries more vulnerable to threats like climate change. Looking at the long-term effect, Pacific Island nations are facing slower economic growth. The combination of tariff, supply chain problem, and less aid is making it harder for these countries to grow, especially since they already struggle with high transport costs and limited export options. Tourism is also being affected. With the US and China economy slowing down, fewer people are traveling to the Pacific. This is hurting countries like Fiji and Vanuatu that rely on tourism for income.